It's an honor and a pleasure to give the 6th Palgrave Macmillan lecture. My name is Matias Renengo. I'm a professor of economics at Bucknell University, as Stephen told you, and I'll be talking about decolonizing uh, economics and the new Palgrave Dictionary of Economics. I first want to thank Stephen and Wyndham for their generous introduction and for framing some of the limitations of the profession and for discussing a little bit of the history, of the dictionary, and in that suggesting also some of the limitations that the dictionary or the previous editions of the dictionary might have. I want also to emphasize that what I'm going to say here, although my co-editors and myself, Esteban Perez Caldente and Jayadi Ghosh, are broadly speaking on the same page of what the task of decolonizing the dictionary is. There might be, the views that I'm going to express are, at the end of the day, my personal views on this. And I finally want to thank the team at Palgrave Macmillan, the whole team, in particular to Ruth Lefebvre, without whom we wouldn't be able to do our job. So what is our job? What's the task at hand of decolonizing economics and the new Palgrave Dictionary? And a useful way of thinking about this is to think of an economics without gaps. And I say this because I use this discussion that appears in Joseph Schumpeter's massive, history of economic analysis, in which he says that between St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1776, 250 years next year, there is a gap, nothing in between that it's worth understanding. And of course, he's thinking of Europe. So it's an Eurocentric view of the profession. And the whole gap is what he sees, as an absence of relevant contributions. And so there are obvious geographic, if you want, limitations to that view of economics, but there are limitations that leave several blank spaces in the understanding of what the profession is, who should be able to develop ideas in the profession, and so it's filling those gaps, the geographical gaps, the gender gaps to which Stephen spoke eloquently about the limitations of the profession, limitations about the problems of developing countries and certain regions of the world, of issues of race, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. The economists that come from what Raoul Prebisch, who is back then, would have called, the periphery, and that, more recently we refer to as the global South. So that's part of what we're trying to do, to extend the scope of what's seen as relevant within the profession. So that would be the simplest sort of definition of what we're trying to do. To understand exactly how we got here, what I want to do is extend a little bit further Wyndham's discussion of the genealogy, if you want, of the dictionary. So he told us that the original Palgrave Dictionary of Political Economy, which was published in 1894 by Robert Inglis Palgrave, who I should add was, besides the editor of the dictionary, for a brief period, he was also the editor of the Economist newspaper, as they refer to themselves. And right after the death of Walter Bagehot, who was the sort of more famous editor of the Economist, and so he was not a professional economist, but he was certainly an economist that reflected what the established views of the profession were. And what he tried to do with the dictionary um, was to provide an authoritative and comprehensive sort of coverage of what economists tended to think at that time. And this is the height of Victorian, the era. It's a period in which the dominance of the British Empire is unquestionable, um, and in which the views of the profession had just narrowed. They have become dominated by a particular view of the economy, by what was known as the marginal is known as the marginalist revolution, by the what Thorstein Veblen, to use Thorstein Veblen's term, neoclassical economics, and the dominance of neoclassical economics reflected in the publication just a few years before the dictionary of Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics by Macmillan, as alluded by Wyndham in his sort of discussion. So the views of economics that are expressed in the dictionary by great authors. Palgrave got people like Francis Isidro Edgeworth, one of the key sort of and most interesting and accomplished of the marginalist authors of the time, professor at Oxford, to write entries for the dictionary. So the dictionary certainly accomplished this uh, task of providing the most complete, and a view of the economy according to what was if you want, the frontier of knowledge at the time. That was the sort of the objective of Palgrave. Uh, but it reflected the limitations of its own time. Just to give the example of Alfred Marshall, that is the key author and the dominant figure in the rise of neoclassical economics. He co-authored a book with his wife, Mary Paley Marshall, who was the first female to take a tripos in economics, or be an economist. And he essentially, although the first book he writes is co-written with her, it's essentially a work of her own. So this, gender biases in the profession are absolutely, central to the period. The particular view that markets, without imperfections, something that his student Pigou would take more seriously, um, um, function in some way to produce optimal outcomes, have become dominant. So it's a view of a triumphant market economy that produces efficient outcomes, and of a British Empire that provides development to the colonies and the best path forward for the peoples of the underdeveloped world. That's the triumphant view of the original Palgrave Dictionary. So when in the 1980s, so almost 1987, almost 100 years after the publication of the original Palgrave, John Eatwell, Murray Millgate, and then eventually Peter Newman, who they may invited to be a co-editor, thought of reorganizing and redoing authoritative dictionary in economics. They thought of Palgrave's dictionary because it had been successful in certain ways. That dictionary had provided an authoritative view of understanding of and the main entries of how economists saw the functioning of the economy. And I should say here as a little footnote that I was a student of Eatwell and his TA in a microeconomics course. But the dictionary comes at a very different period of time. So this dictionary comes, uh, during the 1980s, after the rise of what we would now term neoliberalism. I should say there was no entry on neoliberalism, obviously, at the time. The term comes later. We do have now an entry on neoliberalism by one of the authorities on neoliberalism, Philip Mirowski. So there you have something that has been added, and I'll discuss a few more entries. Um, but what they were trying to do was exactly fill some of the gaps that were missing in the original sort of dictionary. So they did call it the Palgrave Dictionary as a, homage to the original dictionary, because the original dictionary had several things that were positive and they wanted to keep. And they did keep the notion of having the main authorities, the main authors, to discuss some of the important issues as the mainstream of the profession saw. So there are entries written by 36, as Wyndham told us, Nobel Prizes. So Paul Samuelson writes, Bob Solow writes, Milton Friedman writes on for example, the quantity of money. So the key authors do reflect on the topics that made them famous, that led to their winning Nobel Prizes, and so on and so forth. So that part of the dictionary is essentially a reproduction of the original idea of Palgrave. The dictionary also had a preoccupation with adding things that were left out. And there are some entries on topics that would be seen as alternative views of the economy that were not reflected in the original Palgrave dictionary of political economy. So there are entries by Marxist authors, there are entries uh, by several schools of thought, and some of the tension between the conventional views and alternative views are reflected, and in my view, one of the great qualities of the new Palgrave Dictionary in its revival in the 1980s. But it is a period that happens right before, 2 years before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, 4 years before the end of the Soviet Union, a period in which not just the profession, economics, but the whole world moved to, even in a stronger way than in the late 19th century, to an understanding that market failures are not particularly relevant. There are no significant ways of thinking about the functioning of markets and of capitalism in alternative views. This is the height of the sort of the ideological turn in favor of an optimistic view of market capitalism and globalization. And of course, that was reflected on the reviews of the Palgrave, and it certainly and inevitably affected how the second edition of this revived Palgrave, new Palgrave, was to be edited. So there was a criticism written, which I think I should sort of quote, by Mark Blaug, who wrote entries for the Palgrave for the original 1987 re-edition of the Palgrave, that suggested that the dictionary had too many of those alternative views, and which, if you go and count, it's less than 5% of those entries in the original one. So by the time Stephen Durlov and Lawrence Bloom competently edited the second edition of the new Palgrave Dictionary by 2008, the profession itself, not them, the profession had sort of again coalesced into very strongly, neoclassical pro-market views of the functioning of the economy. And on this, I want to say there is an element of the analytical elements, those that, theoretical developments to which Schumpeter alludes in the title of his History of Ideas. But there is an element of the vision that ends up having an impact on what is embodied in the dictionary. So this triumphalist view of the British Empire and of marginalist economics that was in the original dictionary is somewhat reflected too in the second edition of the dictionary, which accepts accepts and reflects this sort of conventional views about the functioning of the economy. But that edition comes in 2008, in the middle of significant crisis of free market capitalism, one in which the collapse in the United States of the subprime market and the subsequent effects in the global economy lead to a reflection of what's wrong with the profession. With the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, asking why did economists did not foresee um, uh, the um, the crisis. Uh, and is at that point that there is a revival, if you want, of some of the ideas that to some extent existed and were trying to be developed in the first edition of the New Palgrave. The ideas, books that came out, for example, Robert Skidelsky's popular, The Return of the Master, or books that discussed the return of certain Keynesian ideas, those Keynesian ideas that Wyndham told us are intimately connected to the history of the publishing house, the Macmillans, and of course with the dictionary itself, that had been in a retreat exactly since the 1980s, and those views have a comeback. The third edition of the New Palgrave comes with no editors, and although it maintains the quality of the high quality of the and concerns with the analytical um, relevance of the entries, that they reflect the best knowledge on particular topics in the profession, something that, as I said, we have no intention to modify, but it doesn't have a particular vision. And so here's where what I'm concerned, and filling the gaps has to do less with necessarily the analytical elements and more with the vision. And the vision is one that we want to fundamentally add things that are missing in the previous editions. And in some sense, we want to um, reconnect with some of the initial concerns of the New Palgrave Dictionary of Economics in its first edition. The fourth edition, I should say, will come in 2027, 40 years after the first re-edition, the 1987 sort of version. So one is obviously we're going to expand on the coverage. We want to discuss uh, concerns and preoccupations of problems, of the economies of the global South. Bring questions of interest and limitations that are not typical of the problems that advanced economies would have in different parts of the world. So we want to have entries, and we do have and have commission entries, for example, on the process of industrialization in parts of Latin America. So an entry on, for example, the industrialization of Argentina. We have had entries on the process of development in China since 1980, with alternative perspectives that are developed very often from the economists in the periphery themselves, that sometimes are critical of some elements of the mainstream neoclassical understanding of the functioning of the economy. We have asked also entries on women and of economists from the periphery. Some examples, one that it's both an economist, that it's an heterodox economist, but also an economist coming from the periphery, and also a woman, would be Krishna Bharadwaj. So she is a somewhat neglected economist, a historian of thought, a theoretical economist with important contributions to understand some of the limitations of neoclassical economics in the discussion of the capital debates. Also a quintessential economist for understanding the problems of development and agricultural economics, in particular, issues of land tenure and so on and so forth in the case of India. We have added entries of Victor Urquidi, a Mexican economist connected to the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and that discusses also the ideas of structuralist ideas, Latin American structuralist ideas. We have asked for entries on and about issues related to sub-Saharan Africa, Tandika on Wire. We have Walter Rodney. We had just asked somebody to write an entry on Eric Williams and his classic book on capitalism and slavery, and of the whole idea of, I should say, of capitalism and or slave capitalism as a concept in and of itself. We have a concern with revising elements that have been neglected in the history of economic thought. So an example would be two examples I'm going to give you. One that we do have scholastic an entry on that was in the original Palgrave, a discussion of scholastic economic thinking, something that I alluded. Our friend Schumpeter thought that was relevant, but then you had to jump. Um, and interestingly enough, there is no entry on the School of Salamanca, that it's in between in Spain, of course, and of the main author about the School of Salamanca, Marjorie, I'm blocking out her name, Grace Hutchison, yes, who wrote a very important book on the School of Salamanca, which was her PhD thesis supervised by Friedrich Hayek at the London School of Economics, I should say. So the alternative views come from many perspectives of the economy. But we also are commissioning an entry of Ibn Khaldun, and the Arab sort of scholar that some view as a precursor to modern economics, and it's exactly in the gap between St. Thomas Aquinas and Adam Smith, and in a different part of the world, that it's completely neglected by more Eurocentric sort of understandings of the profession. So that is the task. Our task is what we want to do is to widen the thematic scope without abandoning the high standards that the Palgrave Dictionary requires of its entries. I should say also what we do not mean. In a sense, is and to give a concrete example, when we talk about the Eurocentric views that were implicit in many ways in previous editions of the dictionary, and certainly in the original dictionary by Mr. Palgrave, we do not mean that one has to deny that the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe. So the fact that some of the consequences and some of the things that are said by people with Eurocentric views tend to be offensive does not provide grounds for denying that, in this case, that capitalism is a European sort of development. But it also allows us not to set aside and disregard the important consequences of the fact that capitalism was developed in Europe for other parts of the world. And we want to bring that into the fold in a pluralistic view that recognizes that there are multiple ways of looking at economics by people of different parts of the world, by people with different gender, race, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.